I'm Devin from Doctored Garage, and in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the theoretical benefits of swapping out your rear coilover springs for the progressive springs from Battle Garage and Swift. I'm going to show how to install these springs, going to show them side by side. I'm going to go over some road testing, a comparison of the original springs that came with my Megan BGRS coilovers, and then test drive with the Swift springs in the same exact area, and we'll also do some on-track drifting, and then at the end of it, I'm going to tell you all my feedback of what I think overall of these springs. If you're like me, you've reached a point where you have enough experience and enough power and a good enough setup in your 8.6 that you're looking for ways to add more grip. So I've gone through and I've tested all kinds of different tires. And I've messed with tread wear and width and tire pressures and all that and figured out what I like. And now I'm at the point where I'm trying to maximize my suspension grip. This is something I probably should have done like a long time ago, but I digress. So let's talk a little bit about suspension setups in general and how it applies to 8.6s, and then we'll talk about the theoretical benefits of these Swift springs. Now, 8.6s are typically low power drift cars, which means they usually benefit from what I consider a loose suspension setup. And by this, I mean that you have a stiffer suspension, which makes it easier for the car to step out and get sideways and maintain a drift. So low powered cars, a loose suspension setup allows you to initiate easier and maintain a drift longer and easier with less power. So I've pretty much always driven on I have Megan BGRS coilovers. I've dialed in some other suspension pieces like, I've got adjustable forlinks, I've got adjustable panhard bar, I've got extended control arms and modded knuckles and all these other different things. And I've also added essentially traction brackets to the rear axle in the form of excessive manufacturing upper and lower four-link mounts with adjustable height positions. 8.6s are great because they've got a great power to weight ratio. So when you dial in the suspension well for the car, well, that means that your lightweight car with your low powered lightweight car can keep up with higher powered cars that are heavier. I've done this with, twin turbo 350Zs, LS S13s, turbo KA S12s, and so on, by having a good dialed in setup and a lot of seat time with the same car. Now that I've added a supercharger to my beams in my 8.6, I now have about 250 horsepower, 200 foot-pounds of torque. I've essentially maxed out the amount of grip I can make from the tires without making suspension changes. The two things that I've noticed that I really wanted to address is, one, on a bumpy course or drift track, whatever, I noticed the car gets upset really easily, and so I wanted to try and address that. And the second thing I wanted to address was, when I'm driving the car and I initiate or on transition, I have to wait quite a bit longer to get back on throttle when compared to some other cars. And the reason for this is that I just don't have the grip, or I've got to wait for the car to grip up before I can get back on throttle. If you watch some of my videos from Rockingham Speedway, you'll see that when I'm driving the full course, I almost always grab the handbrake to initiate, and that's because I'm entering at such a high speed and I don't have the confidence that the car will find the grip fast enough. So that's just kind of a fallback. Normally, I do not initiate with the handbrake. I think that's the wrong technique to use in most cases, and I feel like you should initiate first and then adjust speed with either the handbrake, clutch work, or foot brake. I got to chatting with some 8.6 friends on social media and got in touch with Grant from Battle Garage, and what we discussed was he thinks that these Swift rear springs are something that are going to address the two issues that I have, which is fantastic. I suspected the same thing. I have been eyeing them for a while, and Grant really pushed me over to go ahead and get a set and put them on my car. The reasons why these springs should address the two issues, so I guess we'll talk about each one. So first, the bumpiness that I find upsets the car. So the springs that come on the Megan BGRS coilovers, or most coilovers, they're something like this. These are a linear spring, meaning the more they get compressed, they stay the same stiffness. So that's a pretty typical setup. That's pretty standard for most springs, as they are linear, especially in off-the-shelf coilover applications. Now, the Battle Garage Swift springs, they are what are called a progressive spring, meaning that as they compress, they get stiffer. So at the first bit, they're softer, and then they get stiffer as they get further and further compressed, to an extent anyway. So the reason why the progressive spring should help with that bumpiness is that you can only dial in your suspension dampening and rebound so much to try and absorb those bumps, and sometimes it still isn't enough. So having a progressive spring where it starts softer is going to allow the suspension to move up and down a little bit faster and absorb those minor oscillations, those bumps, to be able to keep the car and prevent the car from getting upset. The other problem I have with grip and trying to find that grip on initiation or on transition, where it takes me too long to get back on throttle when compared to other cars, these springs are softer. So the BGRS springs, they're a 6K. These are a 5.5K. It's pretty typical for most coilovers is 8K, 6K rear. That's a pretty typical standard spring rate. I mean, even like, it was kind of surprising to me to see 8K, 6K on an 8.6, which is much lighter than something like a Subaru WRX, where it's still standard to use 8K, 6K. So the softer spring should allow me to dial in more mechanical grip based on suspension movement. So this is moving towards more of what I would call a tight suspension setup. And that's something you see on a lot of Formula Drift cars, is they've got so much suspension movement when they get on throttle, which allows the car to compress or load the suspension and make more mechanical grip on the tires. Now, with my car, I have a bunch of anti-squat, and I don't want to get super deep into this, but I've got a bunch of other stuff dialed in to try and make more grip even with the stiffer suspension. So this should help me make a lot more grip on throttle. Now, typically the problem with a tighter suspension setup is that it makes it much more difficult to drive, in the sense that when you got off the throttle, the suspension unloads and can cause you to straighten or throw you back the other way. I don't think that's going to be the case with these springs. I think these are a good balance. The ones that Grant recommended are the 5.5K, so they're only a little bit softer than the 6K, but the progressive is really what's going to make the biggest difference, I think. All right, so that's enough talk about the theoretical benefits and the differences. Let me show you these springs side by side, and then we'll get into putting them on the car. Okay, so side by side, they are the same height. I checked this earlier. You can see when they're sitting flat, they're the same height, so there's not going to be any difference there. Okay, so that's neat. They're the same height, so it won't change ride height at all or anything. If you look at the number of coils wound, I mean, that's 1, 2, 3, 4.5, right? Okay, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So a little bit more spring in this than this, but I don't think that's necessarily going to make a difference. Now, one thing I do like about the Megan springs is they have this rubber pad here that if I can, oh sweet, I can pop it off. I'm going to pop this off. I'm going to put it on these springs, and that should help keep them a little quieter when they compress, and that way you don't get like chatter. Anything else side by side? I mean, I really don't see. They're the same diameter. They're going to fit just fine in those spring perches. These are pretty much a standard size. They fit nice and tight. Man, I wish I had a little bit of rubber on there. Oh well. So yeah, that's that. Let's go ahead and get this put in the car. Green and pink actually looks pretty good together. So if you've got an under axle exhaust like me, first step is going to be to unbolt it to allow it to drop down, because we need a whole axle to be able to drop down to get the springs out and get the new ones in. The main thing that holds this up is the rear shock. So unbolting both sides, right there and right there, that's going to allow the axle to drop. The next thing is figuring out what else is hanging it up. So like I said, the exhaust, possibly the sway bar, and possibly the panhard bar. So let's get started and we'll see what all ends up needing to come undone. Okay, now we have the main things unbolted. What we have to do, we've got to use our jack to place underneath the diff on the axle, so that way when we start pushing or pulling the shocks off of the mounts, this can allow the axle to drop down. We're going to do it very slowly just to make sure there isn't any other interference. If you couldn't tell, my rear axle setup is a little different, so I might have more or different clearance issues than you do if you're using just a regular GTS rear end or an SR5 rear end. This is out of a Volvo 240 rear axle, so yeah, just a little bit different. just like that, we got the axle lowered. That's all it took. I didn't have to undo the sway bar, the panhard bar. You can see the springs are starting to droop out of their pockets here on both sides. So we're gonna plop these things out. All right, so you can see some of the damage from just using linear springs. Well, one, this is a little piece that goes in between the spring and the actual adjustable sleeve here, and that's a little bent up. So I'm gonna get that fixed. But these are kind of the big problems, is because it unloads the suspension so much, the spring ends up loose, rattling around, and starts eating up the threads there. So yeah, a little bit of a problem that I'm gonna see if I can get fixed with these other springs. Okay, so now I have the springs on the seats. I swapped the rubber pads over like you saw earlier. I got these guys, both of them were a little bent, a little metal collar there. Got both of them straightened out. I just put it in the vise, cranked it tight, and did that all the way around until they got tight. So now we can go ahead and put those in the car. Something that's important to note is that, see how the spring sits kind of like that, right? There's a big separation there. On the spring pad on the axle, there is going to be a drop for that. So make sure to line that up on the rear axle spring seat. That way it's sitting in the correct position. Okay, before I put the axle back in the car, something I need to show you. A little bit of grease goes a long way here, right? So trying to get this smoothly to go back on here is really difficult because you got rubber against metal. So if you add a little bit of grease, suspension grease, whatever grease you got, splooge a little around it, and then it'll make it a lot easier for those shocks to go back on, so the axle can get pulled back in the car. All right, we have the rear axle lifted up enough to get at least this one lined up. So we're gonna see if we can push this one on, then we're gonna get that one lined up. Might have to use a rubber hammer. That's normal. If you're gonna hit this, make sure you use a rubber hammer and try not to hit your other stuff in your coilover. You might not have these, but I do. It's an external oil reservoir. That's how I get adjustable dampening rebound separate. Well, we're gonna go for a little drive now. Down to the mall and back. It's been a while since I've street driven this car, so this will be interesting. I tell you what, I absolutely love driving this car. Yeah, it sucks not having air conditioning. It's not the most comfortable thing, especially when you got grippy tires and no sound deadening and all that, and it picks up every noise. But it puts a smile on my face better than almost any other car I've owned or driven. It's just so much fun. All right. Just going for a nice Sunday drive. I'm a race car, that's all. gonna do a couple of laps around the mall because there are some bumps and I wanna make sure I hit all the right ones. Here's some bumps right here. Ah, here's a big bump. Oh. 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 We go over on this side. Oh. These are little speed bumps. All right, so I'm just driving down my street and I feel like I can already tell a difference that the back end doesn't seem to hop as much. That's kind of neat. I mean, so far so good. It actually feels a lot better. Going super fast here. I'm only doing like 25, 30 miles an hour. But I can already tell that like things bounce around less in the back. Here are these speed bumps. Okay, we'll take one at an angle. It is pretty good. It feels a lot better. It feels a lot smoother. Before, like even some of the stuff in the back of my car that isn't quite as secure, you know, it'd bounce and make noises. Whereas this, even just this little bit, I can already tell that things aren't getting as unsettled or noisy. That to me sounds like it's working. It's doing exactly what I was told it would. Cornering acceleration. Yeah. Seems to hook a little better. That's not really a good test. We'll find out when I actually go drifting, but this is feeling pretty dang good so far, man. Pretty dang good. I'm at Rockingham Speedway, about to test out these new Swift springs. I'm hoping that these new springs are going to give me a little bit more grip on the initial huck and for settling into drift. Oh my God! All right, let's summarize all my experiences with these springs so far here. So I put about 25 to 30 laps on them on 2 different track layouts, as well as a couple miles on the street. Now, the street test was a little bit more subjective. However, my subjective opinion, the car drove over bumps a lot smoother, it was a lot more comfortable, and it didn't seem to sacrifice any type of handling or performance. It was just a less harsh ride, so it felt great. It didn't seem like anything was loose or sloppy or anything like that. All right, so the track test was still, a little bit of a butt dyno test, but I tried to keep things as measured as possible. So, for example, the car had the exact same tires front and rear, the alignment was the exact same, tire pressure was the same. The side-by-side comparison videos, both of those were the 3rd lap on a fresh set of the tires, so everything should be pretty similar as far as tire pressures and temperatures go. It's probably worth mentioning that I had a passenger in the car with the Swift springs as well, so that should have slowed me down a little bit. Now, definitely off the line, the car hooked a little bit better, and I immediately felt I was more confident in the car because I could tell there was a little more grip. So I hucked the car in, top of 3rd gear, no questions about it. I didn't feel like I needed to check up or anything at high speed like I had to with the old springs. The other thing too is that, one of the major things I wanted was to be able to get back on throttle sooner. And that for sure happened. It was probably about 1.5-ish seconds sooner that I was able to get back on throttle after an aggressive initiation. So I initiated sooner, I initiated more aggressively, and I got back on throttle about 1.5 seconds sooner, just by changing springs. Same course layout and everything. Now, once you get through that first sweeper, that back section had some back-to-back manjis there. So, I noticed too that I was able to get back on throttle on transition a lot sooner as well. The car felt really smooth. Now with the old springs, I had to grab 4th gear to try and build speed fast enough to stretch it out to get to that 2nd sweeper. With these new springs, I left it in 3rd gear and I had more than enough grip because I was still moving faster than with the old springs. The car, the track has some bumps in it over that section of paving, and it just floated right over the bumps. No problems. So I was able to initiate a lot more aggressive, find the grip faster, get back on throttle faster. Transitions, same thing. I was able to get back on throttle, so I'm not going to lose distance on chase. And the car felt really smooth over some of these big bumps, and it didn't cause any type of loss of performance. The car was a lot faster. So if you're chasing down the ultimate AE86 suspension setup, this is a major piece of the puzzle. You definitely need to get a set. I wish I would have gotten some sooner for my car because I was chasing down these problems all kinds of other different ways, and all I need to do is change the springs. So definitely get yourself a set from Battle Garage.